I'm really glad to have the opportunity to be back here again with Kyle R. McNease. And I had comments in our last conversation that you have all this wisdom, and where did all that wisdom come from? So today we're going to hear your story and find out where all that wisdom comes from. And I wonder, I've read a part of your story just on Twitter, and seen a part of your story on Paul Vanderklay's channel. And then you sent me a copy of the write-up that you did about your story. So I'm a little bit familiar with it, but I'd really like to just hear it from you to me.
Sure.
So one of the things that we've talked about on my channel a lot in the past is the idea that it's the obstacles that we run into in life that really build us. And it sounds like you ran into a pretty big obstacle when you were, I think it's college age. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So why don't you tell us about that obstacle
Sure.
and what it did to you?
Okay. And again, thanks so much for taking the time to speak with me. It's a pleasure to be back. And let me first start by saying whoever those commenters were, if they spent some time with my wife and family, my parents, they would probably argue there's not that much wisdom involved.
Well, we can all be wise for a few minutes on YouTube.
That's right.
Right.
That's actually how I started the piece. It's interesting is my grandmother, she had this saying, I mean, I'm sure she heard it from somewhere, but, bought wit, it's good if you don't pay too high a price for it. And I think that the first part of my life was that way, is everything was bought wit. And I've been talking a lot with my parents about this lately, just the kind of changes that are going on culturally, environmentally, economically, politically, and how drastically different that is than the world that I grew up in. And it was such a sheltered place, it was very much like growing up in the Shire, but it's also very hard. And I don't think a lot of people could relate to that now. And that's even further removed than my ancestors. And some of my earliest memories were shaped by suffering, but mainly other people's. Again, I come back to this notion of community, because for whatever it's worth to other people, when you are isolated from the world, you do band together. And I've said this on numerous occasions, and I don't know if people quite understand the extent to which this does a number on you, but I grew up in a very close-knit church that my great-grandparents started. And even though my parents lived 10 hours away from one another, my mom grew up in South Florida, like I told you last time, and my father in Georgia, but it was her side of the family that actually started the church. And it was actually his family that attended the church. So I sort of say, it's a little bit of kismet that they met and were here at all. But in that tight-knit community, you grow up around these wizened, hoar-haired, gray-haired people that form the basis of what you think an elder is like. And so at our church, we had both communion, the Eucharist, and we would do foot washing. And one of the reasons for that was they told us, when you're young, you think that the thing that would be humbling is to wash someone's feet. But you quickly learn, especially when you're a kid and they would let you, they put you with someone who was older than you and sort of teach you, this is how you do it. And they would let you do it for one of the elders in your church. And you thought this was like one of the coolest things, because here's this person I respect so much, I think so highly of, and I'm washing their feet. I mean, one, that's weird. I mean, in our context, it just seems weird. But on the other hand, despite it being weird, it's this phenomenon of this person's humbling themselves before me. That's wild. And so then as you get older and you're allowed to participate in this more fully, the unthinkable happens when one of those elders that you've looked up to your whole life stoops and washes your feet. Slowly and surely, you start to see, just like a forest that's being culled, one by one, they disappear from the ranks. And I'm old enough to remember that in the Deep South, they would still have people in their homes, which is, I mean, I don't know anyone else my age who's had this experience, but, running to find my parents and stumbling into, a casket there up against the parlor wall where everyone would come and pay their respects. That just, it just sticks with you. There's no way to get free of that at a very young age, you are bumping up into existential reality, whether that's the death of livestock that you raised and had, a relationship with, and at a much higher level, people that you had a relationship with that had a huge impact on you. So I think that was a sort of context, is death and suffering were never far away. But for me
so even before you faced it yourself, you were not unfamiliar with the context of death and suffering.
No, unfortunately, I don't really have a moment where, as soon as I was old enough to remember, I was old enough to remember that there was no Ernest Becker's amazing book, The Denial of Death. There wasn't that bifurcation between this person's living, they're part of the community, and we're going to put them away now that they're sick and they're dying. It was very much a part of life. I mean, I can remember my dad, and I never understood this at the time. I've never even spoken about this. It's really, really kind of buried deep in there. But there was a deacon at our church. His name was Mr. Mercer, and he got cancer. He was suffering greatly. And I remember my dad leaving one morning and us asking, "Where are you going?" He was like, I'm going to see Mr. Mercer. I'm going to shave him." And I just remember thinking, like, why? I said, well, he needs it. He can't do it himself right now. And him expressing what an honor that was and how sacred that was. So yeah, for me, I just think it's part of it. It's all part of it. And you can't escape that. You can't escape suffering. It's sort of the matrix that, and I don't mean Keanu Reeves. I mean the matrix, the substrate of this world. And I'll throw this as an aside, and if you want to go down this path, please, we can explore this. And for other people that want to talk about that, let's do it. But I would actually say that on naturalism, on strict naturalism, in a materialist worldview where there's no God, this is all just, it could have been any other way. I don't see where you come up with the idea that suffering is unfair, that there's injustice, that this thing that happened to you in life that you feel aggrieved because it really does hurt, where we get off thinking that that's not just the way that it's supposed to be. That's the status quo. Because I have no reason to believe that without God, there should be any goodness at all. And you can talk about evolution and look, to just put some brackets on that term and say, I don't think we have a good idea of what that means. And so we've just sort of, it's like a trunk and we've packed a lot of stuff in it. And if by that you mean unfolding consciousness and there's a mind behind all of that, okay. But if you mean strict neo-Darwinism, then we really need to talk. But
well, I mean, it's the whole idea of the scientific, materialistic, reductionist worldview that everything is made up of little bitty parts and they're rising up from the bottom, and eventually somehow this arises and here we are. And I mean, first of all, it makes no sense at all because there's there's no way to achieve identity in that of anything. You can't quantum physics can't really explain why an apple is an apple, much less why Kyle is Kyle.
That's right.
So yeah, I mean, the issue of suffering is one that the aggressive evangelistic atheists like to throw at people, because there are a lot of evidences of suffering in the animal world, parasites and entities living and dying and all of that. And they throw that at us as though it's kind of funny because they throw it at us as though that's a mark against God. But why would you be fighting against something that you don't believe in?
That's right.
Right. So it just it's kind of ludicrous from any standpoint that you look at it. But when you look at it from the other side and see the kind of chiastic structure of all of life, that somehow all of life has to go through that very narrow center before it can come out the other side, then everything starts to make sense, right?
Yeah, and the question regarding theodicy is, I mean, people have been tossing this around. I mean, Job is one of the oldest narratives that we have, and it really is an interrogation into what does it mean to be a human? What does it mean to be a human in relation to God? And what I would say is, Mother's Day just occurred, and I was sitting there and I was overwhelmed because we went to the beach and my wife wanted to do it, and I knew it was going to be like, I was going to schlep around with all of this junk, and it was going to be a big ordeal. But it was Mother's Day, so I wanted to make her happy. And you know what? It was so amazing, and I'm so glad she wanted to do it because I really thought this spot had been overhyped. And I've been a lot of places in my life, and I've seen a lot of beauty, but it really, really was amazing. And I'm not even going to mention it because I don't want to. No, I'm kidding. But we were there, and it was just, I was sitting there, I was like, who gets to do this? I mean, how many millions of humans have lived before this moment, and none of them got anything close to this? Not one day did they have a lyrical moment like this where it was, what do I have to do? I'm going to honor my wife. We're going to go to the beach. We're going to have a great time. And here I am in my mind, just sort of complaining, like, oh, we got to go to the beach and I got to pack them. It just goes to show you. I mean, I started thinking about it, and I was okay. So the default mode, for all we know, it's just baseline suffering, right? And what philosophers and mathematicians and scientists will try to do is they'll say, okay, well, let's hypothesize this in our own imagination, the best possible world that we can think of. And it's interesting to me that almost always the best possible world they can think of leaves out most of the elements of this life that are hard and that are comprised of suffering. And so I'm not saying I understand it. I'm saying there are some things that are mysteries. There are some things that are so fundamental that they're very hard to discover. Like, I think it was Feynman that said, a theory of everything in physics will probably be so simple that it's hard for you to even find it. Now, how can that be? And again, we still have to negotiate the language for this in a postmodern world. But what does it mean that God he's divinely simplistic? He doesn't have all these moving parts in him like we do. We are constantly being made and unmade. And for me, I just think that really the naturalist has to struggle with the opposite side of the coin. I just have a very good explanation for where suffering comes from. It just comes from living. I mean, if you live as a biological organism, you're going to experience degradation. You're going to experience senescence. That's part of life. Okay, but where does goodness come from? It's not just epiphenomenon. Because suffering is it's an existential truth serum. That's the moment that you cannot lie to yourself about your pain. You can't lie yourself out of it. You can lie yourself in and out of relationships, in and out of money, you name it, lie. I know Jordan Peterson talks about this a lot. Like, sometimes lying will get you exactly what it is you think you want. The problem is, taking that too far. If everyone does that, you pollute the commons, and you can't build a society where you can't trust one another and trust that what you're saying is true. So for me, I just look at it and I say, we have no way of knowing that this isn't the best of all possible worlds. And it may even in some ways, you could make an argument. There certainly are people that make the argument that it's better than the best of all possible worlds, because the thing that was meant for us, if you want to state it like that, the idyllic relationship that Adam and Eve had with God, that in some ways they are, I don't want to say mere creations, but they are creations of God. And the opportunity that's afforded us through Christ is we're no longer that only, that we're invited to be partakers of the divine nature. That sounds blasphemous. I'm just sitting here in my, house saying that like it's not a big deal. We're made the righteousness of God. What? We're invited to theosis, to become one with God. It's so staggering a suggestion. That to even think that way, it takes, I don't know that you could just step into that. Even as a young Christian, I could quote those verses, and I thought I had some sense of what it meant, but I did not. And the older I get, the less I think I understand the complexity of that and just what that looks like and what that means for us.
Well, the older I get, the more that I start to think. And then, of course, I never know if what I'm saying is heretical or not heretical, but the more that I think that the concept of marriage or the truth of marriage or the image of marriage is at the center of everything. Because when Adam and Eve were in the garden and they walked with God, that was a relation of such intimacy that it was like a marriage. And the church is the bride of Christ. And so that's intended to be a marriage that's intended to be consummated at the marriage supper of the Lamb. At some point in future history, there's going to be this consummation at the marriage supper of the Lamb, where we become one with him, and that's the marriage. And it's out of marriage that life arises. I mean, it's like this picture of marriage, of oneness out of which everything else comes, is like the picture of the oneness at the beginning of all time, out of which everything comes. And then, I mean, it's beyond me, because it's beautifully simple, and yet it's so complex that I can't wrap my mind around it. But there's something about that picture of marriage, because marriage is a triad. There's the husband and the wife, and then there's God. And there's always a picture of a triad. As far down as you can go is that triad as you go, and then as far up as you can go is that triad. And but we're getting a little far afield, because we're talking about suffering in very general terms, but you went through a time in life that was no longer something that you could just philosophize about, right?
That's right. That's
right.
And
the only reason you can philosophize about it now is that you went through it as a personal experience.
This is right. And it's why professionally I've been so annoying to so many different disciplines. And what you find is, this, and I'll get directly to that, but it's so funny to me, because this is how removed from things we are. As some really great scholars that I admire, they were having this debate about suffering, meaning of life, and death. And like, as I was sort of critiquing some of their points, they were like, no, you misunderstood what we're doing here. You're critiquing a philosophy of meaning in life and suffering and death. We're philosophizing about the philosophy of meaning in life and suffering and death. I was like, oh, so you're even further removed. I was like, then that's my critique, is that you're so far removed from the actual keening of a suffering person in their hospital bed. You have fundamentally no idea what it's like from the outside, even like a phenomenological, you go there, you study, you embed yourself like an ethnographer. You don't know what that's like. But you also don't know what it's like to be there. And I didn't either. This is why it's one of those things where you can tell people what it's like, and they sort of hear you in a way, but they don't. There's no way to prepare oneself for something so earth-shattering as to say, tomorrow, Karen, you are not going to be yourself ever again. I mean, not yourself. You will be a new person to your own mind. It will be a far dimmer version of yourself. And if you're fortunate, you will live out your life knowing what you've lost and what it cost you to continue. So for me, I don't know. I was so simple in many ways. And I just sort of accepted the good things that had been handed to me. I directly hadn't been handed many misfortunes. I mean, unless you want to consider growing up not, financially very well off or any of those things, then yeah, okay. But that so was everyone else around us. I mean, that wasn't unique to me. And in order to get out of the life that was sort of structured for me, the thing is, it's you work a factory job, you work at a plant, you do something like that for all of your life, you imbibe all these chemicals, and then you die a gruesome death from cancer or heart disease before cancer. That's sort of pretty much the script. Is in an agricultural area, if you don't farm, well, if you do, you're going to die of cancer, almost guaranteed. But if you don't, then something else from your work environment is going to get you. And so the thing that parents want for their kids is for you to be able to get out. And I was blessed enough that around about my junior year in high school, I could clearly see there was a path forward for me, both athletically and academically, which is, again, that's not everybody's path. And one of the most formative conversations I've ever had was with my older brother, who pulled me aside and was like, look, man, you can do this. You can get out. And you should. And we'll do anything we can to help you. And so there's a sense of loss, though, when you venture out and you feel like you're leaving everything you love behind. And in taking that voyage, it was the most incredible thing that I could have done. I have no doubt in my mind. I just have no doubt that was the path that God wanted me on at the time. And I was just blessed in ways that it's hard to put into words what it feels like to move through the earth without great effort, to be able to run as long as you want, as fast as you can, for hours. I was just talking to a friend a few days ago, and he's preparing for a triathlon, and he was mentioning to me his training, and he kind of asked me about my background. So I ended up going to college, and I played tennis, and we would do insane things. I don't even know how this is still a thing that the NCAA lets happen, but we'd get up at like 4:35, get on the charter bus, go to a location at a university somewhere, and we would play. And so I'd play for like 2.5, 3 hours for one singles match. Then I'd get with my doubles partner and we'd play, an hour and a half, 2 hours for a doubles match. We'd eat lunch, take a few minutes to breathe, and then we do it all over again with another team. I mean, that's the level of fitness that goes into that. It's just hard to put into words, like what doing that day in and day out and just living that. And I really structured my life around trying to be as optimum a performer as humanly possible for me. And so while my teammates were sleeping in, I would sneak to the gym and I'd get an extra session in first thing in the morning so that I could be ready when we got out on the court. And so I just devoted everything to that. And we even had a curfew. So it was just a very regimented life, and I loved it because all of my attention was focused on getting better, physically feeling and functioning the best that I possibly could. And then academically, just feeding my mind with all of the lectures and reading. And I don't think that I was ungrateful or unthankful for that. I think I was deeply appreciative. Looking back, I wasn't nearly as appreciative as I should have been, but I didn't know that. And so I get this cool opportunity to go to Oxford and study under C.S. Lewis's, one of his proteges. And I mean, this, pinch me. This cannot be happening. And so I get there, and it was just like a hand in a glove. I mean, it just fit. And I don't know how, but it just did. And probably it's since I graduated from high school, almost every class I've ever taken in my life, I ended up developing some sort of relationship with the professor. I wanted to know what they knew. I wanted to know how they knew it, how it shaped them or formed them. And so I developed a really close relationship with my professors there. And one of the last things they said to me before I came home for break, they said, you belong here. We want you to come back here for grad school and go get your prospectus, and we'll get this done. It was just, this world cannot be happening. This can't be real. And I was awarded this scholarship from a generous foundation. And so I had this money that was unrestricted. Take it, study at Oxford, and have your best life over there. Do what you need to do. And so, one week, if I was studying about Byron, if I was reading Manfred, then you know what? I was in the Alps doing it, because that's the way the tutorial is. It's so hard because you have no one to hide behind. It's just you and them. It's one-on-one. And I've told my wife so many times that, they would be busted up about the way an American's education is structured because we didn't read classical texts in the first language. And so I knew I had a steep hill that I was climbing, but it was just fantastic. And I mean, my life was, 8-10 hours a day, writing, reading. I would produce about 30 academic pages a week, which for people who don't do that, that's an excessive amount of work. And it didn't feel like work for me. It felt like breathing. Was awe-inspiring because I just couldn't believe I was getting this opportunity. And, to be able to say, hey, I was reading this in Tolkien, or I was reading this in Lewis, and someone who knew them both to like put their piece in, to share their perspective on that conversation or that agreement or disagreement. It was just, you're bumping up against history in a way that wouldn't have been possible for me otherwise. And so why am I going to such great lengths to paint an overly rosy picture? For me, it wasn't. I mean, like, you can ask people who are in my life. I'm the type of person who I could call my parents and I'd be like, hey, guess where I am right now? They'd be like, I don't know. You're in the Alps. You're in a Greek isle. Yes, I am. That's, praise God. Yes, that's true. And, I had a beautiful woman in my life that I cared deeply for. We had been together for 4.5 years. I thought for sure that we would be getting married and having a family and all of those things. And so I come home from my break at Oxford and I'm thinking, okay, well, I never planned on doing any of this anyway. This is just gravy for me because I always thought I would just be a missionary somewhere and that was it. but all of the pastors from my area were like, no, you need to go to school. God gave you a brain. You need to use it. You need to, learn as much as you can and use it for the glory of God. Okay. I didn't necessarily like that admonition, but I took them up on it. And so something happened over my Christmas break. And, for the sake of time, it's hard to unravel all of this, but my brother and his wife, they had purchased an old farmhouse and they were remodeling it. And I was on break for a few weeks, so I did a lot of the exterior work. And what we didn't know at the time was it was lead and mercury based paint with asbestos underneath. And so, it was bad news bears for me. And there are a lot of people who will debate, can you ingest enough through breathing, through respiration, whatever? Can you ingest enough that it would shut your system down? And the answer is probably, where's your starting point? For me, having lived in an area where during the summer, every day, there is a plane that flies immediately over the top of your roof and starts releasing chemicals so that by the time they hit the field, that field is getting sprayed with whatever it is on that particular day for that crop that's going to kill those organisms. I mean, you're just getting drowned in that stuff. So I think my level for what would have pushed me over the edge is probably different from yours or someone else who hadn't encountered that and built up an accumulation of these kinds of toxins, because a lot of them do carry heavy metals in them. And so
you didn't know at the time that this was affecting you, though, right? You didn't find that out until a lot later.
Yeah, no, I didn't know. I was just working. Like, I would literally go there as soon as the sun came up. I'd grab a quick bite, go there. And it's very refreshing for me because I'm a frenetic person. I like both chaos and order, but I like to go between chaos and order. That's why I love my wife so much, is like, she is an anchor point for me. And she helps me not be manic and vacillate too much between these two worlds. But it's almost like what you can see behind me is like there's a little bit of order, and then above me there's a little bit of chaos. And that's sort of how my personality is. It's just the way that I'm wired. And so, yeah, I loved reading all of these great texts, but I also loved getting out and doing hard things, hard work. And so this to me was like a vacation. It really was. And I thought I was doing something to help my family, which was cool too. It's kind of like a wedding gift. So yeah, I had no idea this was occurring because it's not like it did it all at once. It wasn't like I got sick all at once. But what it did do was, and again, this is a very old building, so it wasn't maybe made like some people who will be listening right now wondering, yeah, maybe if your house was built before the 70s, there's some lead-based paint in it. Get that checked before you do any work, and especially if there's asbestos involved. And so I did that. A few weeks go by, and I don't know, I just didn't feel right, didn't feel good, which was very unusual for me. So much so, the irony that right before this happened, I was back at university and planning all the graduation stuff, and I was meant to graduate top of my class. They were sending out awards and all this stuff, and my mom calls me one day in my dorm, and she's like, "Hey, when's the last time you went to the doctor?" And I was like, I don't know. And she was like, well, has it been recently or not so recent? And I was like, honestly, I don't know. I don't know when the last time I've been sick. I think it was after I played like 3 hours in the rain one match, and it was cold and wet, and I ended up getting like strep throat or something like that. And she was like, well, look, we got these two insurance policies on you and your brother, and I'm just kind of wondering, do you think you even need it anymore? And I asked her, I was like, are you paying for it? And she said, yes. I said, drop it. If you're paying anything for it, drop it. I don't need it. Man, it was like 2 weeks later that I don't, it's like I woke up, and the first real symptom was I just felt like I was kind of like when you go to the dentist and they give you nitrous oxide, and you're just sort of a little bit loopy feeling. That was kind of like one of the first things. And I was having like pain in my legs, but I assumed it was just because I'd been like working out too hard or something. And it just started progressively getting worse. And I mean, by the hour. So I'm going to class, and I had like long hair with curls, and I never dried my hair, just like go. And it was winter. And one of my friends saw me walking to class, and she was like, hey man, your head's soaking wet. And I was like, yeah, what of it? And she was like, you can get pneumonia. And I was like, why would you get pneumonia? She turned out to be right. What I didn't know was just my immune system was very quickly being undermined, that those heavy metals, they get in there and they bind to things that they should not be binding to, hormones, blood cells. They're just doing catastrophic damage. And the only way your body can shuttle some of it out, excreting it through urine and sweat and things like that. But if you get a large enough dose, then your body tries to compensate for that by hiding it in your tissues and muscle and fat, whatever it can do to sort of spare you. And so it just shut down my immune system. And I mean, when that happens, it's like a building that you see under controlled demolition, just pow. Every latent virus, things like that every one of us have, they all came viciously roaring back at the same time. And along with that, yeah, I mean, I developed a chronic pneumonia that I could not shake it. I mean, it was like 9 months of just that thing. And it was like teetering on the brink of like, I'm about to leave this world. And for people that, we love to think that this life is just going to unfold in a certain way, and there'll be clear signposts that will let you know, hey, my demise might be getting close. I'm, in my 90s, and at some point, I'm gonna die and leave this earth. When you're 21 and you haven't had major health challenges, that's just not on the radar. It wasn't for me. And so within a matter of days, I go from, functioning at university, although not feeling right, to me having to call my parents and being like, something is wrong with me. I don't know what it is, but I feel like I cannot get up. And my dad was like, well, just come home. Just come home, take a break, and come home and see how you feel, see the doctor, see what's up. And so that was the plan. And then on like January the 15th, I think, I ended up having to call my mom at work and be like, dude, get here now. Like, I'm not going to make it. And they took me to the hospital. And by the time I got to the hospital, I could not say words. I mean, I couldn't articulate a thought. And it was so bad that like I knew I was like on my way out. It's just this, for me, it just felt like this cold hand just was pushing on my chest. And then I was going deeper and deeper down. And I had like this inkling of a thought like, hey, when you're about to die, aren't you supposed to do something? And I was trying to think of pray, call out to God. But I couldn't even think of the word God. I mean, that's how bad. And that's why I built up by saying like what I was doing at Oxford. It's not to boast about that. It's to say this is how bad it was. I went from being able to do that to not being able to say simple words in a matter of weeks. And by the time we got me to the hospital, I was almost, completely incoherent, unconscious. I was like semi-conscious. I could hear things that were being said, but it wasn't like I had any communicative capacity. I just remember the doctor asking, like, has he been anywhere? Has he been traveling? And they were like, yes, yes, yes. And I remember him saying, does he have AIDS? Because he's presenting just like every AIDS patient I've ever seen, which is interesting. That was a first sort of clue. He had an insight that a lot of doctors missed, was the way that my immune system had cratered. It did look like someone who had HIV. And I mean, whenever you have an immune collapse, that is what it looks like. And so I was promptly hospitalized, and my life was just never the same. Again, interrupt me anytime with questions or thoughts that you have. But
well, as I understand it, you went through this hospitalization. You also went through a segment of time during which you were in extreme pain. It wasn't just the disorientation, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is why I say that suffering is an existential truth serum. And what happened to me was like, existential dynamite, because I had no previous experience with that. And there's a lot of fascinating research. Some of this is culturally mediated. Not all pain leads to suffering. Sometimes the suffering comes from projecting yourself into the future and projecting the pain with you, and sort of tightly coupling those things, like I'm never going to be free of pain. It's always going to be like this. I can't do this anymore. Oh, it was so excruciating because it was happening at the cellular level. It was destruction of, my immune system, my I don't know the degree to which there's a continuum. And I remember a doctor saying to me, I said, am I going to die? And he didn't say no. He just said, not right now. You could, but we're watching your numbers and there's a process here. And that doesn't mean it, by process, it could be fast, could be slow, but we would see some numbers start to change. We're monitoring those at the moment. So we're going to keep you, filled in. Well, yeah, like I remember this one of the, say this is like 2 or 3 nights into being in the hospital. This for sure is, of the many, many times that I thought this is the last moment I'm going to spend on earth, this so fundamentally changed me, even as a religious person. I don't think I'd ever had any kind of experience like this. This is what has made me have to question the world that I live in. And I'll just tell you what happened, and then I'll make room for questions and pushback. But I was laying in a hospital bed. I'm hooked up to all this stuff. And I felt I don't know what to say. I really don't. My soul, my spirit, my inner being, whatever it is, the thing that sort of like makes me was trying to leave my body. I mean, I was that weak, that decrepit, that fast. And I could feel it happening. Like I could feel it trying to leave my body, and me just trying as hard as I could to like fight to stay in the game. And I looked over at my mom, who was sitting at the foot of the hospital bed off in the corner. And I just kind of like, motioned for her to come a little bit closer. And I just kind of whispered to her, can you lay across my legs? And she was like, what? I was like, I can feel myself trying to leave my body. And of course, for her, she was probably, help, he's hallucinating. But I could, again, maybe I was hallucinating, but it's a real experience. I had an experience of standing as say this is my body and this is where my feet are. Well, it was as if I'm laying there, but then I was also standing at the same point where my feet are laying in the bed. I was standing up, looking out at the room from that height. That's why I would question whether or not it was a hallucination or a delusion. Is like, I can clearly remember the way that the room was structured from almost 6 feet above where the hospital bed was. And I remember being terrified because I was like, if this much more space, I don't know how this works, but like it felt like if I left a little more, I was gone and I didn't think I could get back. And look, it was a hard, long road because even once I was cleared from the hospital, there was no context for what was going on yet. So one of the problems that we have in talking about this is that people see me now, they hear me now, and it's really hard to go back and imagine what it would be like not having any assurances that you would get to this point. There was no one, not one person other than my family, bet on me to make it, to survive. In fact, many very well-meaning Christians would, plead with my parents, like, don't you want to just ask the Lord to go ahead and take him rather than seeing him suffer? And my parents were just like, no, I can't. My mom to this day will tell you she could never enter it. It was unthinkable to even entertain the idea that I would die. But they waited to tell me this until I got better. But each morning, she and my dad would have a debate about who was going to go into my room, because neither one of them wanted to be the person who found me dead. Which, just saying that is so, it makes me want to just use a bunch of expletives. Because, I mean, I felt like that was true. But the people who were trying to encourage me were, you're going to make it, man. You're doing better. While privately, they were speaking with one another and saying, like, man, I don't know, is he going to make it? And so many great members of our community and other communities far and wide, people would just come from nowhere. People I did not know at all would come and they would pray for me. They would come over to our house and they would just be like, hey, we heard this guy's really sick and we were wondering if we could pray for him. And sometimes that it seemed to make things worse, if I'm telling the truth. It was just like the devil was not going to let go. I mean, it was you could just feel that there was both a physical battle and a spiritual battle, which is why I think Job's story is so compelling to me. Is there's multiple things happening there, but when you talk about the pain, it bends you. You only have a few ways to negotiate with pain. You either blitz yourself so that you can blunt the very receptors that take in that information and let you know you're in pain, or you have to figure out a way to be malleable enough that when it bends, you won't completely snap. But there are plenty of times where you're going to have micro snaps. I can remember being in such aggressive pain at a level that it didn't matter what you gave me. There's no drug that was going to touch at the cellular level what was happening. And so I can vividly remember just pulling my hair like as hard as I could, just trying to pull it out. And I was slamming my head against the headboard, trying to like knock myself out while praying like, God, either take me or heal me, but don't leave me like this. This is just the worst. And that is that moment when I got to that point. That was the point. That was my stasis. That became my everyday for years. There was no relief. There was no bright sunshine rays that came in and chased the darkness away. I laid like that. My body slowly and surely wore down, because no one tells you this, but it is in fact the case that you need gravity. You need to bump up against gravity. And if you don't, your body says, I mean, it's almost like living in space. When the astronauts take off, within the first few minutes of leaving Earth's atmosphere, they start peeing out their skeleton, their skeletal, like all of those minerals and calcium and all of that stuff. Your body's like, oh, I don't need that. So if you're living in a hospital bed or something like that, where you're completely prostrate, your body's just like, okay, well, he doesn't need all of these muscles and ligaments and tendons then. And so my parents had to watch me go from being a collegiate athlete to they were having to spoon feed me. That was so hard to watch. As a patient, you always know how well you're doing based on the faces of the people who love you and who are close to you in that moment, because when you see their face grimace, like that's where you're at. If it's bad enough for my parents to look like this, then it's bad. And so lingering there for years without any hope or sign of something better coming along, no treatment that was emerging. The relationships that I had that meant so much to me, they faded. And one by one, people stopped calling or checking. And the irony is that I still had awards coming in. And I remember laying there, like my parents would bring my mail into my room and they would just replace it at the end of the bed and then kind of open it and show me what it was that I'd gotten. And there were these awards like most outstanding, student of literature, like highest grade point average, whatever it was. And I just remember they were like, what do you want to do? I was just throw it away. Why? I was like, it doesn't mean anything. Doesn't matter. Who cares? Like I'm on my deathbed here. So yes, at 21 turning 22, I sort of entered this realm where I had a moment of clarity where like none of this stuff matters. None of it matters. And I don't mean like Solomon's vanities that nothing matters. I meant none of those peripheral things that I had been working so hard for, that in the end, what mattered most, as I thought, like these are the, final days of my life, was that like the relationships that I had, the people who remained close to me, the love that I had in my life. And it will sound insane for me to say this to some people, but read The Diving Bell and The Butterfly. He says it way better than I do. Bowlby, he died, I think, days after he finished writing this novel, where he had.
Is that the guy that couldn't speak, and so
Yes.
he had to
Yes.
signal somehow another person letter by letter and wrote the book that way?
Yes.
Yeah, that's just unbelievable.
It's unbelievable. I mean, the kind of courage it takes. This was a prolific writer and thinker who had locked-in syndrome. And so the one thing he could do is, like blink an eye. And so he had someone dictate, and they managed to dictate this, biography. And in it, he talks about like whether it was just them pushing him in a wheelchair to like some other part of the hospital, or some view that he hadn't seen, that these were sort of these lyrical moments. And sometimes when he would be in the hospital bed, he would have these moments of reverie. And please hear what I am saying, because I am not in alignment with people who think you have to diminish whatever the bad thing is that happened to you. Like, I'm not, if you got raped and that's the really terrible thing that happened to you, I don't need to try to quote verses at you and quote psychology studies at you about CBT and reframing and things we can do about post-traumatic stress. I want to say that's egregious. It's terrible. It's awful. And for me, I'm not going to apologize for how bad it was, because it was terrible. And even as it was terrible, there were these momentous occasions where God would step in. And through gritted teeth, I would just either say thank you or hallelujah, like just a whisper of praise, because somehow his presence would get to me even there. And to me, it means so much more because I know where I was at, the agony that I was in, I don't feel like I need to downplay it to be like, and God is also good, because what I can say is, even though that pain didn't disappear or diminish, he made it known to me that his presence was more valuable and more significant and more meaningful than even that really gruesome pain that I was in. And that, to me, in growing up reading David saying, one thing have I asked of the Lord, and one thing that I desire. I want to dwell in the house of the Lord forever. It's better for me if I were just a doorkeeper in the house of the Lord. And the presence of the Lord it's infinitely more valuable than even what suffering is in your life, or the upheaval, the loss of the relationships. I lost everything in my life. Like my whole life was just like packed up, and I never even, like the people that I knew, everything, like no one even had a warning. And this is, slightly before cell phones were ubiquitous, and they were there, but they weren't like, iPhones didn't come out in 2006. This is just a couple of years before that. So it just wasn't as mainstream. And so there was just sort of,
wasn't the pain also intensified by the fact that there were a lot of people who just didn't even believe that you were actually sick, that they thought a lot of it was psychosomatic, or did everybody recognize that there was actually something wrong with you?
That's an interesting question. That's a really good way to think about it. I don't think it added to the pain level, because it just is what it is. If it's an 11, nobody's going to talk you out of that. No one can make you question your pain. They cannot. That's what I mean by suffering, and existential suffering and pain. I could paint you a rosy picture and tell you, like I told you about the beach, like you might be someone who would be inclined to be like, that sounds pretty good. And maybe you yourself would want to go and do that because of the way I talked about it. I could talk you into that. Like there are motivational aspects that we can sort of activate in a person's mind. If we know something about their psychology, we can use social judgment theory and some of these other theories to kind of guide people persuasively. But if you've been shot, you need a surgeon. You don't need me to tell you that because you got shot in your arm, it means you didn't get shot in your lungs, so it's not that bad. No, if you get shot in your arm, it is that bad. It's as bad as it is when you get shot in your arm. This goes back to what we spoke about last time, about you can't have the suffering that you don't have. That's just not the way it works. But they certainly made my suffering worse, while it didn't impact the level of pain. And by that, I just mean that you could see a lot of this. I mean, it was so predictable for someone like me. I just knew when the pandemic happened, people were not prepared. They were not prepared for this level of isolation, because that's a whole other, like we can get to the isolation aspect because we're social creatures, but physicians are trained a certain way. There's a framework for thinking about these things. And when they're taught, if you hear hooves, you think horse, not zebra. And so they're always going to start at the most practical thing. Is it this? Is it this? Is it this? And again, there's always an art and a science to these things. It's why, I mean, you think about it. There are a certain amount of physicians, researchers, physicists, et cetera, all the way down the line, authors. A small portion of them will do an excessive amount of the discovery, the work, the publications, whatever it is. The Pareto principle just sort of, I don't know what it means, that it seems to cut across so many different domains in life and applies pretty well. So I was seeing physicians who were incredibly well-meaning, but they heard hooves, they thought horse. And if it isn't a horse, they're like, you know what? It's in your head. My mom had one of the best comebacks to this one time. They were like, don't you just think your son is depressed? And here I am, like, super emaciated. I can't walk. I can't do anything on my own. And she was like, I mean, he was traveling all over the world. He was at Oxford. He was engaged to a very beautiful woman. His life was pretty great. So if you're asking, is he depressed right now? I think the answer is yes. And if he isn't, something far worse is wrong with him if he's happy with his life right now. So she just sort of wanted to put that question to bed. The question was like, not, are you depressed if you're living like that? Because it's just, you're surviving. You're fighting to stay in the game. But was that the precipitating factor? No. And so,
because they still didn't know at this point that it was a heavy metal issue, even after all these years of.
Yeah, because it's like, I don't have a perfect analogy for this, but you know, it's one of these things where it's stochastic, and the precipitating event was heavy metals. But the net result was what one physician called the perfect storm of illness. It's almost as if whatever enemy is at the gate, whatever things are assaulting your body at that given time, your immune system sort of deals with it, whether it's cancer, whether it's a virus, to the best of its ability. But then suddenly, if you have something come in like the heavy metals did for me, it's like it pulled down the gate and just let the barbarians in, and they did their damage. So it was very hard for them to disentangle precipitating event from current presentation. Because again, at like almost every measurable virus that you can have, I had all at once. And a great, I guess I would call him a colleague, Michael Mina, formerly at Harvard, his team discovered the connection between Epstein-Barr, well, we would, mono, no big deal, and MS, that it is a causative agent in MS. Well, we were told for many decades, the prevailing thought was that there's a blood-brain barrier and these viruses don't do anything interesting to the brain. Well, that's not the case. And for me, I mean, I saw every kind of physician you could see, and every one of them found issues. They found labs that were bad. They found all types of physiological things that were beyond what they should have been, out of the normal parameters. And when I was scheduled to go to the Mayo Clinic, they called my parents one day and they were like, listen, we can't take him. And my mom was like, what do you mean you can't take him? He's like super sick. And they were like, yeah, but he's got so many things wrong with him. We don't even know what floor to put him on. And so that was one of the worst days of my life, for sure, because I had been banking on some expert being able to come in and, like the show House, do this great diagnostic thing in 24 hours. Maybe they give me a wrong medicine and figure out that by giving me that, it was something else that was wrong. That's sort of how their episodes unfold. He's trying to save the patient, and sometimes he hurts them a little bit and ultimately helps them. There ain't no Dr. House. And you're not saving someone's life that's that messed up in one episode. And so when they told me that I couldn't even be a patient, I just felt like that was it. That was game over. And it just so happens that a close friend of my brother's had gotten cancer not long before my illness began. And he was at MD Anderson in Texas. And while he was there getting treatment, he just appealed to his physician, who was an expert hematologist, one of the best in the world. He was like, will you just take a look at this guy's labs? And he agreed. And so we sent him all that stuff. And, the doctor called my mom and was like, yes, I can see it in his blood. I can see something is wrong with this kid. I just don't know what it is. I don't know what that thing is, but I can see it. So, and I'm talking about this with you, and I'm trying to be a bit sanguine about it. But lest people misread me, like, I'm telling you, if you are a viewer out there, I thought about ending my life. I felt like if I was going to be forced to remain in that state without even, the prognosis was just, maybe one day if you get better, much better, you'll be able to take yourself to your own doctor's appointments. Like, what kind of life is that? It was certainly light years away from where I was at that time. And so that was the best anyone could even conceive, is that maybe one day you'll be able to do that with your life. And so that, again, is why it's so important for me to say, this is what I was doing before. This is what happened to me. And it was so drastic, these two worlds, that just as drastic how good it was equally bad and worse. And I don't know why these two things have gone together in my experience, but on the day my daughter was born, my wife's labor was 36 hours, God bless her. And the day my daughter was born, I was in the ER getting life-saving medication and fluids so that I could be there for her birth. I did not want to miss that. I did not want to be robbed of that. And I begged the doctor. I was like, please, man, I know what the protocol is, dude. I know it. But just give me these drugs and let me go back up there, please, so that I can be there. And thankfully, he did that so I could be there for that moment. Because there were so many of the really great things in life that you miss out on. You start to become a ghost. And it isn't that people don't care. It isn't that they're callous. It's that they have their own lives and they're living and doing what they need to be. But there are millions of people right now who will be living this experience, unfortunately. And the level of isolation, it is hard to describe. And so when you have any of these really enjoyable things come up, and every time it's a no, you can't do it, your body won't let you, it's hard to come back from that. And that's why I say to you that on strict naturalism, status quo bias, the world being what it is, what right do I have to think that just isn't how my life should have been? Who can I appeal to and say this was wrong? Because it feels wrong. And I think as collectively, we've made a decision to say that this is wrong, to leave people in this state. We want to do something to try to help one another. And the World Health Organization's very definition of health is it's that you have all of the things that you need physically, emotionally, socially to be well. It isn't just the absence of illness and infirmity. And so for me, I can't calculate, I can't know the enormous amount of things, the opportunity costs that you can never get those things back. I can never be with my best friend for the last time, because you talk about something that's flooring is when the person you're closest to puts his or her life on the line for the people that he loves, and he's killed in action. And then you can't even go and pay your respects. And I couldn't even physically cry. I mean, the act of crying itself would have crashed me into the ER. So there's a way in which that just feels like torture. I mean, to like not even be able to pay respects feels on some level wrong. But who's going to adjudicate that? And I told you I would allow room for the pushback and say, well, then that's just your way. That's the psychological tricks that you're doing with yourself so that you can get through life. No, man. I mean, you put yourself in a similar kind of state of deprivation over that long a period of time. You can't live on placebos, okay? You can be in a study and have a placebo effect of some size, but it isn't as if the placebo, it's not generalizable to all areas of our lives, which is why I find it just extraordinarily stupefying that people believe that the answer to not believing in God, not having faith in God, is to go through the motions because there's probably a net benefit because of something like a placebo. The thing is, the placebo effect works on someone because they believe it's true. They believe they're getting the therapy that's supposed to work. That's why they respond the way that they do. They don't think I'm just getting a sugar pill and that's going to do the same thing as the therapy. So I just think, like, when you're in that situation, it's life and death. You're watching people around you die. People are being wheeled out foot first that were previously, this far away from you. Their head was on this side of the wall. Your head is on this side of the wall. And you know what? They didn't make it through the night. It can't just be something you tell yourself to somehow make your life better. It isn't just wish fulfillment. This thing it's bigger than that. It's deeper than that. It's harder than that. And when people ultimately find themselves in those situations, that's when they recognize, okay, I can't just talk myself in or out of this. That isn't it isn't going to work. I think probably one of the best examples of anyone that was so obstinate in their atheism, Christopher Hitchens, when he got cancer, and as he was progressing through it, I think maybe even if it had been a different type of cancer, it wouldn't have been the same, but the esophageal, man, that thing it's connected to everything. You need it every single second of your life. And that cancer broke him down to the point that he wrote a piece on, and again, I know this isn't exactly how he meant it, but Nietzsche's whatever doesn't kill me makes me stronger. And he just made this blistering critique of it. And he was like, this chemo is not making me stronger. Okay, you guys, this is not, I don't care what he said. This stuff is not making me better. It's not making me stronger. It'd be much better for me not to have cancer. And so, it took years and years to find the right assortment of doctors who were both skilled clinically, and by that I mean there's treatment algorithms for things, but then there's also intuition, which we don't necessarily know how to quantify yet, but they think of something or they feel something, or maybe you looked a certain way and it reminded them of something they read when they were in med school. And for me, this physician felt rather counterintuitively when he did testing. He found blood work that he felt like the numbers were not showing levels high enough for me to have metal toxicity. And he was like, yeah, this is sort of paradoxical. And that's at the heart of medicine. There's tons of cases that are like this. If you take a kid who has ADHD, like they do in the studies, and you give them Ritalin or Adderall, it's a paradoxical effect. Why would you give someone who's hyper a stimulant? But for whatever reason with them, and probably dopaminergic reasons, but it habituates them to doing the thing that you wanted them to do that was very hard. So the dopamine probably makes it easier for them to concentrate or to sit still. It isn't that the drug sort of works at the level of higher order consciousness that says, be still. It isn't like an inner parent telling you what to do. It's a paradox. And it was the same way for me, is they only found those things out paradoxically. So the best I could do was tread water while suffering and, watching my body just sort of dissolve to next to nothing, just like a skeleton.
So eventually they figured out, well, paradoxically, they began treating you. And it took a while for you to kind of come out of this, but where are you now? Have you regained your function? Are you still in pain?
I think that for me, it's an ongoing journey. There's always mitigating factors. After treatment, you're right, it got way worse for a few weeks there. I didn't think it could be worse, but it was like I was almost like a comatose person. I would be awake for maybe a couple hours here and there, and I would try to get something in my body, and then I'd pass back out. And so,
well, isn't that kind of the reaction that happens frequently when you're trying to kind of detoxify from something? And if they're trying to get these heavy metals to flush out, it's going to be that same kind of detoxifying.
Yeah, there's a sort of truism that detoxification is reintoxication, and you have to be careful with that balance. But also, it's that there's Herxheimer reactions where, if they're finally starting to get at some of the underlying things that are allowing your immune system to be so dysfunctional, the medicines that you're using to treat all of that also starts to become more effective. And so those organisms don't want to let go either. Their existence is dependent upon you as well. And so they don't want to give up. So just as the moment you get these healing crises, and it definitely was that for me. And it certainly made me wonder, had we done the right thing? But as you start coming out of that, the one thing that physicians have agreed with, no matter their discipline thus far, is that the miracle, they would say, like, it's a miracle that you survive, but it's really a miracle that, like, what you went through, the process of recovery should have taken you so much longer. And we don't really know how to explain that like that doesn't mean it was easy. And it certainly wasn't as fast as I would have liked for it to have been. But if you deal with someone who's so like if you have someone who's elderly in your family and they fall and they go into the hospital, say for a hip surgery, those are the things that actually are very problematic for one's survival, because it isn't just the breaking of the hip, it's that you're bedbound. And again, if you're older, then your body's less adept at repairing. There's a lot more repair work to be done. And so you can be deconditioned very quickly. And that's why that turns out to be so fatal. And so for me, I was just fortunate that had I not spent so much time, I thought I was playing tennis because I loved it, and I did. And I thought I was practicing for hours a day to be great, and I was. But as it turns out, I also needed that capacity because my body was going to be put through the absolute ringer. And I mean, there's just no doubt in my mind I would not have made it had it not been for that. So there's, maybe the same genes that made me more susceptible to X, Y, and G also made me more susceptible to physiological recovery. But these things are hard to talk about because it's a continuum. I mean, because you still have things that happen. And so you tend to think of it as a rain barrel. If you can have a hole in the bottom of that barrel where if rain comes in, some of the water comes out, you're good. The problem is if none of the water is coming out and it rains, that thing can fill up. And once it starts overflowing, that's one of those biological metaphors for that's where you get into trouble and disease processes start. And so we've worked very hard to try to fill the rain barrel with as many holes as we can. But the laundry list of drugs and supplements and things that I have to do to maintain life are, it's hard to describe. Like if I did a vlog, it'd be the most uninteresting vlog ever of what it takes to stay alive. But it would give people some portrait into how much effort it takes. And that is one thing that I miss. I mean, every day I miss getting up in the morning and not having to take a beta blocker, because if you wake up and your heart rate spikes too much. See, for me, the dangerous thing is endocrine related. There's no way of knowing in advance how much cortisol you're going to need in a given day. Just like maybe a person with diabetes, maybe they don't know how much insulin they're going to need in total in a day. they have a rough estimate. If they eat a certain diet, they're going to need this much insulin. And if they were to check their glucose, they could always adjust up or down the dose depending on what they needed. We don't have a really good metric. We don't have a good way of doing anything like that in real time with cortisol and epinephrine. And so what happened with me is, it just happens. I have no reason. I have no idea why, but my adrenals will just stop producing. And when they do, you go from being okay to you can be dead in an hour. It's just one of those things. So how am I doing right now? I'm enjoying this conversation. I'm enjoying this cup of coffee. But
you were able to go back to school and get your degree. And so, I mean, I kind of want people to have a little bit of the rest of the story.
Sure.
So you, and somewhere in there you got married because you said that your wife was having a baby. And so you were able to go to the birth of your child. So there was the down, and at some place that turned around a little bit, and you've started edging back up again.
Yeah, which is, it's different because when I entered my 30s, most of my friends were bemoaning the fact that they were slowing down or this and that. And I was like, you guys have no idea what you're talking about. You have no idea. Like, turning 30 was like, whatever, man. It's better than, like, my 20s it was just unmitigated suffering. So any day that I'm not in the hospital like that, it's just like, man, it's a gift from God. It's awesome.
Well, you look so young. I wouldn't have known that you were already 30. So
no, I'm in my 40s now. I'm 41. Wow. Yeah. I mean, it took, it's not a quick fix. There's no quick fix for this. And so, yeah, my life is much more on par with someone in their early to mid 30s because I missed out on so much of my life in that way. But when I started getting better, it was just one of those things where I'm taking an inordinate amount of medicine and there wasn't a lot physically that I could do yet. And so my parents were like, why don't you finish your degree? Okay, I'll do that. And the university didn't want a huge liability on their hands. So there was a lot of red tape around this. And so I had to go back to school in this candy apple red. They didn't select the color. That's just arbitrary. But it was a candy apple red scooter with a basket on the front of it. And so I had to have that in order to get back on campus. They would not let me back without it. And so my doctor was like, absolutely under no circumstances do you need to use that unless like you absolutely do, because you're going to get deconditioned very fast, which is what we've been working against. And so, yeah, I go back to university and there's all of these bright, brilliant, healthy people that are like, why do you have a bright red scooter in your room, man? And so it just opens up avenues for conversation. And these are some of the lyrical moments. Maybe everyone will have suffering in their lives, various degrees. But for me, when I talked to the people that were there when I went back to university, I mean, I talk to them regularly. They're close. It's a closeness in a way it's hard to describe because it was such a raw experience for me. There's deja vu. I feel like I've been here before. Then there's jamais vu, which is like, have I ever been? I don't think I've ever been here before. And that is like how my life is. When I wake up, there's this sort of alienating effect that I just see the world different. I see it. It's all sort of mysterious to me now, and I don't suppose that goes away. I just I think in terms of energy expenditures and all that, like how much energy did that take for that person to do it without them even knowing? And so, my friends would hijack that scooter, just being slackers, and they would take it to their classes and ride it around outside like it was an all-terrain vehicle. And those are, they're great memories for me because they sort of normalized this guy who was at the very edge of society. And for some of my first social experiences to be back at university where things sort of imploded for me, it was, I felt like poetic. And we just chopped wood and carried water. That was the thing, is I would just focus on the academic work and focus on trying to keep my body healthy. And while there, I had opportunities to talk to students, friends who were going through things. And again, for me, the people that I was hanging out with that were talking to me were like people late into their 80s. They'd be like, what do you think happens when you die? Those are the conversations I was having. And so to be back with young people who just on a very different part of this continuum, it was great. It was the time of my life in many ways. I mean, the kinds of conversations that I was able to have there changed my life, but I think it also changed other people's lives because it was maybe their first experience with someone who had a very different way of life. And that isn't for everyone. And, in the published piece that you referenced earlier, I always want to say this just so that I can, the kind of illness that I had, the kind of life that I lead now, it's not for everyone. And so I want to make sure I say I don't fault the woman that I was with for deciding that that was not something she could do. Now, did it hurt? Yes. And that level of pain, I didn't, someone leaving you on your deathbed, that's really hard to kind of figure your way through. The thing is, we were very young, and if you're not called to that, then you're not called to it. And she was not. And so I don't fault her for that. But it was around 2009, I think that I started to get my sea legs back under me. And one of the first things I did was I went to Honduras to do mission work and to teach there. And I was living in a place called Mi Abuela, shout out to anyone from there. And I was taking the hydroxychloroquine like you're supposed to for malaria prevention. And it ends up that because I traveled a lot to attend one of my friend's weddings there, I got multiple strains of dengue. And so just as I was starting to get my life back, I had to call my family and just be like, hey, listen, I'm in the hospital. I've got dengue, medio. And so the way that process unfolded was just, you're in a place where the rules and regulations for treatment are not necessarily what you're accustomed to. And so, man, they just blasted me with as many drugs as they could think of to try to keep me alive. And it was the first time that I had ever experienced a familiarity with death that, I don't mean to say they took it in a nonchalant way. It was just the manner of being with me is, my friends and coworkers come to the hospital and they see me and they be like, yeah, you kind of remind me of my cousin, but I think you're going to make it. Like, my cousin didn't make it, but I think you're going to make it. So that was really hard for me. I was like, man, y'all really think it's a coin flip? And so the doctors decided after a while, they're like, dengue, it's different because instead of you getting immunity that makes you be able to ward off any future strain, the lethality comes from introduction of new strains. So you either need to get immunity to all of them at once, or you only need to get it once. Well, that already wasn't happening for me. I got it more than one time, got more than one strain. And so they were like, you're going to die if you stay here, man. I'm going to just put it to you like that. You're going to die. You will. And we didn't really know if I was going to live or die then. We had to how did I know? I had to wait to see if I was going to start bleeding out. And I woke up in the middle of the night and I looked over and there was blood all in the bed. And so I was like, oh, it's over, man. And as it turns out, it was just an IV that it had gone through the vein. And so it just was bleeding. But I thought it was like, that's the beginning of hemorrhagico. And so I'm going to hemorrhage and die. But fortunately I didn't. And they told me, they were like, look, you need to go home. You need to take some time to convalesce. And there are lots of people out there who may be hearing my story and be like, well, why would you do something like that? And, you and I talked about last time Peter walking on the water. And there's something about as long as he was in faith and he was doing what he was supposed to be doing, he's walking with the Lord, towards the Lord, and he's okay. He takes his eyes off the Lord. That's when things get rough for him. Look, I was doing what I felt called to do. We're all going to die, man. That's just baseline reality. It's so hard to wrap your head around. I woke up this morning taking my little girl to her nursery, and they're building on to the mausoleum in one of the graveyards. And I was like, man, that is just what a poignant way to start the morning. A reminder that because we must die, let us live. And baseline reality, that's where we're at. That's going to happen. So given that that's going to happen, how you want to live your life? And I felt called to, if I hadn't had so much opportunity and access to medical care and to doctors and physicians and nurses and parents, I would have been dead. And so what about these vulnerable kids who had nothing and had no one? I mean, I just felt compelled to do that. And then whenever I ended up getting dengue, it devastated the kids because I had to leave, and they were like, well, I don't get to leave. And that was brutal. Getting on a plane and leaving them, man, that was so hard because I was like, they don't get to leave. But it wasn't an option for me. They were like, you're leaving. The doctors were like, you are getting on a plane and you're leaving. And when I got home, for continuity of care, my physicians carried on the treatment plan, and they were like, dude, you just got to lay low for a few weeks. And it's while I was laying low, one of my friends was like, why don't you come hang out with us? We'll do some light. You can come with us on our street ministry stuff, and you can go to some of my grad classes with me, just, hang out. And so while I was doing that, I just decided, well, the vaccine for dengue fever it's in the works. And they were at that time, like, could be any time, really. Could be next month, a year from now, who knows? But my plan was really, I'll convalesce, and in the time being, I'll just go to school, and work towards being able to help vulnerable people. And while I was doing that, I decided, there were opportunities to do a lot of things and go a lot of places, but there was a fantastic church community in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, at LSU. And I ended up going there, and that's where I met my wife. And we met through clinical training that we were doing. She was working at a sister location. And so sometimes she would be like a supervisor of me on a project, and other times I'd be a supervisor for her. And so, yeah, I don't know. I mean, she was talking, and again, this may be a curse, because there'll be a time where this is not the case, but she didn't believe I was as old as I was at the time either. And so that was like one of our first interpersonal just conversations, is she heard me talking to some of our colleagues, and I said how old I was, and she was like, "You're a liar." And I was like, "What are you talking about?" She was like, "You're not that old." I was like, who lies about being older than they are? I mean, who does that? That's not a good pickup line. Yes, I'm much older than you think I am. Who's the lady that signs up for that? And so she was like, "Show me your driver's license." And so I did. And she was like, "Really? Why are you here? What are you doing? Like, what's your story, man?" And so I told her just some of the stuff that was happening to me. And I don't know why this is so impactful, but we got to a point of my story where this is my way of understanding what I did. Other people may have other reasons for it, but when I would look down and see hair falling out, it unnerved me, because it was like, I can't do anything to stop this. And so I feel like I understand in my own way why you see cancer patients shave their heads and think everything is out of your control except for how you lose this. How this disappears is up to you. You can either shave it, or it can just, the chemo or radiation, whatever, it can take it. And so I was telling her, my brother, he and his friends every spring for baseball season, they would all shave their heads, and it would drive my parents crazy. And so he comes over one day with some clippers, and he was like, "Yeah, I'll shave it for you, man." And so this clandestine fashion, he shaves my head, and my parents get home. My mom's like, "Oh my God, why did you do that? You look so sick." And I was like, "Mom, I am sick. That's why we did it." For some reason, that story just busted her up, and she just cried and cried. And she just said, she felt like she just wanted to be in my life from that point forward. She didn't know how or why or whatever, but she just felt compelled to be in my life. And listen, it takes an extraordinary person. I mean, it really does, to have. I had some time to build up to what I would call game time decisions. I have a very hard time projecting myself into the future. I mean that daily. So when I sit down with people, I sound a little bit like John Vervaeke. If someone, where do you see yourself in 10 years? I'm going to go all the way back to the history of the singularity until now and be like, there's so many causative agents happening in our lives, and there's so many things that are unforeseen that you don't even know what you mean by that question. What you mean is, are you going to invest a lot of money in me and then me turn around and leave? If that's what you're asking, the answer is no. But if you're actually asking me to predict the future, we're very bad at that, and I can't do that for you. So she had to sort of adapt to what I would mean by game time decision. She's like, hey, do you want to go to this tennis match? I'm going to buy you tickets and we're going to go. And I'd be like, well, it's going to have to be a game time decision. She goes, what does that mean? Like, how am I doing that day? Do I need to go to the hospital? Do I need to give fluids? If not, then yes, let's do it. And so, yeah, man, I mean, again,
It sounds like the bottom line is that, and this is one of the old gospel songs that I learned when I was first a new believer that was so meaningful to me. One day at a time. And it's a very simple old song, but one day at a time, sweet Jesus. That's all that's all I'm asking of you. That's all you're asking of me. One day at a time, it sounds like that's the way you live your life, one day at a time. And sometimes it's 1 minute at a time.
That's how you have to live in the throes of the illness. And the first time I ever felt understood by anyone during this process was years after, when I was in complete darkness, listening to Viktor Frankl talk about what it was like in the concentration camps. And he said something. He said, in the concentration camps, a day lasted longer than a week. And I was just like, yes, that's exactly right. Because you don't measure, when your life is on the line, the goal is, can I make 24 hours? Can I make it through 24 hours? I'll worry about the other 24 hours if I make it through this. But if I don't make it through today, there's no point worrying about tomorrow. I got to make it through today. I got to throw all of my resources at today. And so when he said that, it was like the first time that I recognized there are other sufferings, the common theme there, and the reasons for it are multitudinous. People have all kinds of different sources for their suffering, but there are some just commonalities there that hold. And that is one of them, is that to get through things like that, you're right. It was like, Lord, please, if I just make it to the sunrise, like, I think I can stay. I think I can make it if you just help me make it through this night. And the lie, this is why it's really hard for me to live in the world that we live in right now. I don't fit in, because once you know that, you can't go back to the illusion that there's that your plan, that you can just architect everything and engineer everything. And what's so fascinating is, if you did a strategic plan for your own life, and I said, okay, Karen, tell me what your 10-year plan is, and then tell me your 5-year, your midterm, your long-term, your immediate term plans, you could enumerate those things really well. And then if I said, what's going to happen 10 minutes from now? You'd be like, I'm not sure. I had a TA at Florida State. I think he was in his 60s at the time. He was a very successful guy. His kids went off to university and he wanted to go back and become a professor. And so I was immensely honored to have him with me, because he was such a wealth of knowledge. And we were sort of talking about uncertainty reduction and the way that theory can be applied. And that morning he had a death in his family. And I mean, it happened within 5 minutes of us saying, here's when we're going to meet. This is what we're going to go over. And when he came back and spoke to the class, he talked about how, yeah, he and I had just been talking about what our plan was, and that life intervened in a way that he could not have predicted. And I think that's, people do not want that taken from them. And I can understand why, because it's comforting. There's something that I know about life and reality, that the thing that scares me, the thing that keeps me up at night, is that my path through this world and out of this world probably at least has to be about as bad as it was before, and likely worse, because I didn't die. I could have, but didn't. And all of the talking, reading, praying, whatever, it's not going to change that hard fact. Jesus in the garden saying, Father, is there any chance that this cup can pass from me? Like, no, man, you got to drink it. You have to experience it. And so we don't want to be that protective shell. We want to keep that as intact as long as possible until the moment that existential interruption occurs, and then you can never go back again, because you didn't see the thing coming. You couldn't have seen it coming, and it was headed towards you like a freight train the whole time, and boom, you got hit. And once you take a hit like that, you realize it's possible for you to take another hit like that. You're not bulletproof. And even if you are, there comes a point where you slow down enough that at some point in time, one of the bullets is going to get you. And so the hope for me, for my wife, she does her own thing. I do my own thing. But communally, we do something together. We have Prognosis Hope, that you kind of looked at my life and say, what would you want? What would you have wanted to be different? And I was like, well, no one gave me any whiff of a hope of surviving, and let alone having a life. And it is complicated, because it's just mediated by how are my adrenals going to let me do that day? And what am I going to be able to get away with? Today, I'm having a great day, but I knew it was going to be great when I woke up. It's one of those things. The days that feel more like pre-illness days, when you have an inkling of that, it's, oh man. And then you just start accruing advantage.
This Prognosis Hope is an organization that you and your wife do together?
Yeah. And we've
been fortunate. Can you give me the information for that I can put in the description?
Yeah. So
I'm going to have to go here soon, but yeah, I think that would be terrific. And then we can kind of leave it on the hope thing.
Yes, that would be good. Yeah. I mean, that's hopefully what my life is about, is letting people know that it doesn't matter where you're at right now. I don't want it to seem trite, because there are people that are in situations that look hopeless. But what I would say to them is that give yourself room for possibility, give yourself room for a miracle. And it's going to take different shapes, and it'll happen different ways for people. Sometimes that'll be a breakthrough medicine. Sometimes that'll be someone praying for you and you just never being the same. I mean, Bible said gifts of healings. And so as Christians, we need to be really open and receptive, I think, to the various ways that we can be ministered to in that regard. And so we try to help as many different entities as we possibly can, whether that's missionaries who are translating, or rare disease groups We try to advocate on behalf of people who need it. And I'm certainly professionally dedicated to that, to helping people who find themselves in dire straits and subject to the vicissitudes of life.
That's terrific. I thank you so much for being with me today, Kyle. And I know it's hard to go through retelling a story like this, but I'm confident there will be people who will be helped by it. So I appreciate you being with me.
Karen, thank you so much for your time. I know it was more of a monologue than a dialogue, but hopefully there are some other things that we can speak about that won't be so one-sided.
That would be terrific. Thank you, Kyle.
Thanks, Karen.
Yeah,
Take care.
I'm glad you're having a good day.
Thanks.